Hey guys, tonight we begin with the strange and shadowy year of 536. A year so thoroughly cursed that even medieval peasants, who were not exactly strangers to misery, looked around and said, yeah, something's definitely wrong. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's set the scene. It's the early 6th century. You're a merchant, a monk, or possibly just someone hoping your turnip harvest doesn't fail again. Life isn't exactly glamorous, but it's predictable. The seasons come and go, the sun rises, does its job, and you complain about it like usual. Then 536 hits, and suddenly the sun doesn't. At first, it's subtle. A few grey mornings, a sky that just seems a bit off. People squint, farmers mumble. Someone makes a joke about the gods oversleeping, but the clouds don't clear. The light stays dim. Days pass. Weeks. The sun continues its half-hearted routine, like it's doing the bare minimum to not get fired. Across Europe and Asia, something is clearly wrong, and not in the rain ruined my toga kind of way. The Byzantine historian Procopius, not known for dramatics, wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness. That's historian speak for, this is deeply unsettling and we are all going to die. Other chroniclers describe a dry fog that blanketed the world. Not smoke, not mist, just a weird, lingering greyness that refused to go away. It didn't blow off with the wind. It didn't rain. It just hovered there, like the planet itself was trying to send a vague atmospheric warning and no one was picking up. The result? A year that didn't behave. Crops failed to ripen. Trees stopped growing. Birds migrated in circles. And humans, being humans, tried to explain it. Some said it was divine punishment. Others blamed sorcery, eclipses, or the sins of their neighbours. One guy probably blamed it on a goat. History never wrote his name down, but you know he was there. Meanwhile, the average person, the villager, the farmer, the overworked scribe, just had to live through it. No sun meant colder weather, less food, more confusion, and absolutely no idea how long this cosmic prank was going to last. 536 didn't start with a bang. It started with silence, a weird sky, a creeping sense of dread, and the unmistakable feeling that something was broken. And spoiler, it was just getting started. So, the sun is up, technically, but it's not really participating. It's 536, and across the world, people are looking at the sky like it owes them an explanation. What once was a reliable, bright, mildly judgmental sun has now been replaced with a pale, low-effort disk that looks like it's calling in sick. You'd get more warmth and enthusiasm from a dying candle. Eyewitnesses from Constantinople, China, Mesopotamia, and Ireland all noted the same unsettling thing. Daylight was barely distinguishable from twilight. You'd wake up and assume it was dawn. At noon, you'd assume you'd gone blind. At sunset, well, good luck figuring out when that was. The sun no longer set so much as wandered off quietly, mid-conversation. Contemporary writers described the sun as bluish and without shadow. Now, if you're wondering what kind of sun casts no shadows, congratulations. You're asking the same question every terrified 6th century human was asking, right before they panic-prayed into their stew bowl. In China, They reported that stars were visible during the day. Let that sink in. You're tending your rice fields, look up and see constellations. That's not weather. That's the sky, soft resetting. And it wasn't just dim, it was also cold. With sunlight filtered out by something mysterious and inconvenient, temperatures dropped. Not in a pleasant hot cocoa kind of way. More in the your spring crops think it's January and your toes have stopped cooperating kind of way. It's worth noting that the people of 536 had no concept of atmospheric science. They had no clue what a volcano was doing thousands of miles away. All they knew was that the sun had stopped doing its job. And when your crops, warmth, and general will to live rely on that job, it becomes a bit of a crisis. Naturally, people looked for explanations. The religious saw divine punishment. The astrologers blamed ominous planetary alignments. Local leaders probably blamed foreigners, bad omens, and that one guy in the village who always seemed a bit off. Whatever the explanation, one thing was clear. The sun had stopped trying. And when the main character of the sky calls it quits, you know things are about to get dramatically worse. At some point in 536, people started realizing it wasn't just the sun being moody. The entire atmosphere had decided to act weird. Across continents, reports came in of a strange phenomenon. A lingering, dry fog that didn't behave like any normal weather. It wasn't mist. Mist clears. It wasn't smoke. Smoke smells like something's on fire. This fog just was. Like a vague, damp ghost following everyone around, ruining visibility and morale in equal measure. Procopius, the ever-grim Byzantine historian, described the sun as emitting light without brightness, and claimed this ghost fog hung over the world for a whole year. That's 12 months of not seeing the sky properly, not knowing what time it is, not knowing what season it is, and wondering whether this is just what life looks like now. In the east, Chinese sources noted yellow dust falling from the sky, and, in an extra dash of surrealism, summer snow. Imagine waking up in July to find your crops frosted over and your chickens very, very confused. Ireland's annals speak of a failure of bread, which is poetic code for mass starvation, and also deeply Irish. You know things are grim when the bread is the first to abandon you. So where was this fog coming from? We now believe it was the aftermath of a volcanic eruption, or possibly more than one. Think of it as nature's version of someone blowing out birthday candles with way too much enthusiasm and ruining the entire party. Ash and sulfate aerosols got blasted high into the stratosphere, where they hung out for months, reflecting sunlight, blocking warmth, and making sure your winter jacket became a year-round fashion statement. Of course, the people of the 6th century didn't know any of this. All they knew was that the world had become dim, cold, and vaguely cursed. Crops wouldn't grow. Rivers slowed. Entire regions stopped receiving rainfall. Livestock began dying off, or just walking into the fog out of existential dread. Probably. And just when people started getting used to this new Twilight Zone reality, nature decided to spice things up by throwing in a bonus pandemic. Because what's better than fog that won't leave? A plague that follows it. Eventually, centuries after everyone had finished panicking and/or starving, science showed up. Late, but helpful. Historians and climate scientists, armed with ice cores and radiocarbon dating, asked, what made the sky go full Gothic in 536? The answer? Volcanoes. Specifically, a big one, possibly 2, maybe even 3, because when the Earth throws a tantrum, it really commits. The leading suspect is an eruption in Iceland, a massive one. Imagine the Earth saying, I'm tired. and then violently ejecting a few billion tons of ash into the stratosphere. That ash hangs out like a clingy X, blocks sunlight, and sends global temperatures tumbling. Greenland ice cores show a sharp spike in sulfur from that year. Basically, a frozen receipt proving the planet had an explosive outburst. Antarctica's ice tells a similar story, which is impressive considering it was minding its own business 10,000 miles away. But here's where it gets spicy. The first eruption may not have been alone. Evidence suggests a second eruption followed in 540, and possibly another in 547. That's right. This wasn't a one-time disaster. It was a trilogy, and not a fun one. The Volcanoes of Doom, Part 1, 2, and 3. Now featuring extended hunger scenes and bonus plague. Ash and sulfate aerosols from these eruptions spread across the globe, reflecting sunlight and dropping global temperatures. Think of it as Earth's way of applying a thick layer of SPF 5000 to the entire planet, just without the sunscreen smell. In places like Mesopotamia, this meant failed harvests and economic collapse. In China, snowfall in summer. In Europe, grain prices skyrocketed, and not in the cool stock market way. More in the your neighbor just sold his goat for a sack of moldy oats kind of way. And just to be clear, nobody in 536 knew what a volcano was. They didn't connect the dim sun to some mountain thousands of miles away having an existential crisis. They just looked up, saw permanent twilight, and assumed God was in a bad mood. Which, to be fair, is what it felt like. And while modern science now understands the mechanics, back then all they had were terrified priests, terrified farmers, and skies that looked like the world had forgotten to wake up. So the sun's on strike, the sky looks like it needs therapy, and nobody knows what season it is anymore. Welcome to 536, now with bonus hypothermia. Thanks to our ash-spewing volcanic villains, Earth entered what scientists now call a volcanic winter. That sounds cool, until you realize it wasn't metaphorical. Global temperatures dropped by up to 2.5 degrees Celsius, which, in medieval terms, is roughly equivalent to your entire food supply just died. Now, if that doesn't sound dramatic to your modern, central-heated ears, try growing crops in a world where summer is colder than your ex's text replies. Wheat, barley, grapes, they all just sat there in the dirt like, yeah, no. This wasn't a short-term cold snap either. Tree ring data from all over the world, Ireland, Scandinavia, North America, Asia, shows stunted growth across the board. Trees weren't flourishing. They were surviving, barely. And if the trees were struggling, you can imagine what that meant for the people trying to eat things that grow on them. Frosts arrived earlier. Snow lingered longer. Spring became a rumor. And farmers? Farmers had to pretend they knew what they were doing while watching entire fields fail like poorly planned medieval group projects. In China, records describe yellow dust falling like snow. And in Korea, people wrote of summer frosts. In Europe, summer didn't come at all. Or if it did, it showed up drunk and left early. Meanwhile, animals weren't cooperating either. Herds thinned out. Some died, some migrated, some simply refused to breed, which, fair enough. What followed was a perfect storm of failing crops, starving communities, and the growing suspicion that the world was ending. Very slowly, and in extremely gloomy lighting. It wasn't just the cold. It was the confusion. The not knowing, the sheer unpredictability of the seasons. People had calendars and festivals and planting schedules, and none of them made sense anymore. You might plant in April, only to watch frost kill everything in May. By June, you're eating pine bark stew and pretending it's soup. So yes, the world got colder. But the real chill was the creeping dread that the warmth might never return. By the time the sun had faded and the temperatures had dropped, it was clear something else was dying too. Hope and wheat, but mostly wheat. In a pre-industrial world where nearly everyone was either farming, eating what farmers grew, or stealing from someone who had, a bad harvest wasn't just a bummer, it was an existential crisis. And in 536, it wasn't just one bad harvest. It was one after another, until people forgot what full stomachs felt like. Crops didn't stand a chance. With sunlight at a medieval minimum and cold air sneaking in like a disapproving in-law, fields across Europe and Asia simply stopped cooperating. Barley barely sprouted. Wheat gave up halfway. Grapes? Forget it. Your wine turned into sadness with a cork in it. In Ireland, the annals mention a failure of bread. A poetic phrase, sure, but in reality, that's famine. No bread meant no food. No food meant no energy. No energy meant no peasants tilling the land. And then suddenly, the whole system collapsed like a badly stacked haycart. China didn't do much better. In the Northern Wei dynasty, frost came early, and harvests withered. Rice paddies froze. Fields turned to useless mud. And instead of thriving villages, you got wandering survivors gnawing on whatever roots they hadn't already eaten the previous week. Grain prices soared where they still existed. In Constantinople, people sold their last possessions for mouldy bread. In Britain, there's evidence of population decline. In India, monsoon cycles were disrupted. And in Ethiopia, royal inscriptions abruptly stopped, which is never a great sign. The really cruel part? This wasn't a quick disaster. It dragged on. By the time 537 arrived, the Earth still wasn't cooperating. It kept giving you a little hope, a mild day here, a budding sprout there, only to slap it down with a frost the next morning. The result was a farming community stuck in a loop of false starts and bitter ends. Over and over. Medieval farmers had a term for this: divine punishment. Modern scientists call it volcanically induced climate disruption. But the peasants on the ground just called it what it felt like: the world's longest, hungriest winter. If you were hoping this global catastrophe was limited to one unlucky corner of the world, think again. The year 536 wasn't picky. It was an equal opportunity disaster. Let's start in China, where things were going fine, until suddenly, summer snow. Yes, that's a real thing that happened. Chinese court records from the Northern Wei dynasty mention freak weather patterns, frost in midsummer, and crop failure on a scale that made people start questioning whether the heavens had simply unsubscribed from Earth. It wasn't just snow either. There were dust storms, droughts, and yellow mist. Basically, nature threw its entire special effects budget at Northern Asia. The emperor tried sending offerings to heaven. The heavens did not respond, probably ghosted him. The result? Starvation, famine, rebellions. The dynasty collapsed not long after, because if there's one thing that makes people stop believing in your leadership, it's being both cold and hungry under your watch. Meanwhile, across the world in Ireland, the monks were scribbling grim little notes in their annals. Things like failure of bread from the 12th year to the 15th, which, in medieval monk speak, is like screaming into a pillow. That phrase, failure of bread, sounds poetic. It also means no wheat, no oats, and no porridge, which for the Irish of the time meant they were one bad harvest away from eating moss and whatever didn't run away fast enough. Famine swept through communities. Livestock died or were eaten prematurely. Trade slowed. Villages shrank. And remember, this is an era when there were no food banks, no emergency grain shipments, and no helpful online recipes for how to make a meal from a turnip and regret. Even the weather seemed to mock them. Days were short, grey and cold. The sun came out like it had better things to do. And people began turning once again to religion, superstition, or blaming their neighbours, whichever felt more satisfying that week. This wasn't a regional weather event. It was a global catastrophe dressed as a really long, overcast day. From the mountains of China to the bogs of Ireland, people experienced the same terrifying thought. What if the world doesn't come back from this? While China froze and Ireland starved, Scandinavia just vanished. Not in a dramatic, dragon-riding fireball sort of way. No, this was much more unsettling. Scandinavia didn't go out with a bang. It just slowly dimmed the lights and left the party without saying goodbye. The evidence comes from trees, specifically tree rings. Trees are nature's historians, but with better longevity and fewer opinions. And around 536, the trees in Scandinavia stopped growing properly. Narrow rings. No expansion. Total arboreal sulking. You could almost hear them mutter, "Hard pass." This is a sign that temperatures had dropped so drastically and growing seasons had shortened so severely that not even the pine trees were coping. And these are trees built for northern gloom. Archaeologists also note a disturbing decline in human activity. Settlements go quiet. Farms are abandoned. Burial sites show a drop-off. It's as if entire communities said, "You know what? We're done here," and walked into the woods, possibly to starve, possibly to flee, possibly because even Vikings need a break from existential dread. This happened before the Viking Age officially began, which is important. By the time the Norse started raiding monasteries and terrifying everyone from Ireland to Byzantium, they had already survived one of the worst environmental collapses in history. Some scholars even suggest that the trauma of this period, the famine, the isolation, the population collapse, helped shape Norse culture. That grim, fatalistic worldview, the sagas about cold, cruel gods and long winters that never end. Yeah, that might have been less mythology and more accurate weather reporting from 536. And because the landscape was already unforgiving, the sudden climate catastrophe didn't just hurt, it devastated. Livestock herds would have been culled. Food stores emptied. Entire family lines might have ended in a single season. But unlike some parts of the world, the Scandinavians didn't leave behind dramatic chronicles or impassioned complaints. They left silence, and empty spaces where people used to live, which in some ways is worse. It's one thing to read about suffering in a scribe's rant. It's another to dig up a village and realize nobody ever came back. Now, while the sun was ghosting the rest of the planet, let's check in on the Byzantine Empire, specifically its glittering capital, Constantinople. Enter Emperor Justinian the Fern, a man with grand ambitions, a killer legal code, and absolutely no idea he was about to preside over one of the most catastrophic decades in human memory. Before 536, Justinian had been on a roll. He'd codified Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis. He'd funded enormous building projects like the Hagia Sophia. He was conquering old Roman territories like someone on a nostalgia tour. Things were going suspiciously well. Then the sky turned grey, the temperature dropped, the food ran out, and the empire that never sleeps got hit with the worst vibes possible. Constantinople, being a city that relied heavily on imported grain, was not amused when harvests failed in Egypt. Bread prices soared. Famine crept into the capital. And because that wasn't bad enough, the darkness in the sky made people wonder if the end times had finally RSVP'd. To make matters worse, Justinian, a man who prided himself on divine favor, now had to explain why God had apparently switched sides. Not ideal for imperial PR. Religious panic spread. Clergy warned of judgment. Some citizens turned to asceticism, others turned to blaming literally everyone else. And Justinian? He doubled down, funded more churches, prayed harder, and likely muttered, "This wasn't in the imperial handbook." But the hits kept coming, because no climate catastrophe would be complete without a bonus pandemic. In 541, Justinian's empire got walloped by the first recorded outbreak of bubonic plague, the infamous Plague of Justinian. It arrived by ship, as most bad news does, and within a few short years, it wiped out an estimated 25 to 50 million people, about half the empire's population. Justinian himself caught it. He survived somehow, but his body wasn't the same, and neither was his empire. Rebellions broke out. Military campaigns stalled. Bureaucrats died faster than they could be replaced. And all Justinian wanted to do was restore Rome's glory. Instead, he ended up as the emperor who got hit by darkness, famine, plague, and disappointment in that order. As if 536 hadn't already won the gold medal in historical suffering, nature decided to introduce a new player to the misery team: disease. Specifically, the bubonic plague, starring in its terrifying debut performance as the Plague of Justinian. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill sniffles or a medieval case of ate the wrong mushroom. This was a full-blown pandemic, straight from the pages of future nightmares. And it hit at the worst possible time, which, in fairness, was sort of the decade's theme. By the year 541, just as the sun still hadn't fully recovered and everyone was either freezing or starving, or both, the plague casually rolled into Constantinople via grain shipments. Because of course it did. Nothing like a rat-infested cargo hold to really put the cherry on your apocalypse cake. Caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the disease spread rapidly thanks to fleas, rats, and densely packed cities that hadn't exactly invented germ theory yet. Symptoms included fever, vomiting, swollen lymph nodes, and sudden death. The kind of thing that makes you nostalgic for famine. Estimates vary, but the death toll was staggering. 25 to 50 million people across the Byzantine Empire and beyond. That's up to half the population, gone in just a few short years. You couldn't swing a censer without hitting someone already buried. The Emperor Justinian himself caught it and survived, but many of his officials weren't so lucky. Bureaucracy ground to a halt, military campaigns fizzled, and cities emptied faster than a wine barrel at a bishop's banquet. To the average peasant, this wasn't a scientific event. This was God's megaphone, and it was screaming. And given that the sky was still grey and the crops still sucked, people assumed the plague was the final act, the divine mic drop. Mass graves were dug. Priests ran out of prayers. Funeral rites were shortened to something like, "He's dead. Next." What made it worse was the randomness. Some people died in a day. Others survived and watched everyone around them vanish. It wasn't just tragic. It was deeply unfair, even by medieval standards. And just like that, 536's dark legacy had officially gone viral. By now, the world in 536 and the years following wasn't just suffering. It was spiraling. The sun had taken a sabbatical, the crops had filed for bankruptcy, and the plague was treating Europe like an overachieving party crasher. But for the average person, the anonymous peasant, monk, or goat herder, the horror wasn't academic. It was daily survival on hard mode. You wake up and it's still dark. Not poetic fog rolling over the hills dark. More like, is the sun still functioning dark? You shuffle out into the cold, look at your field of wilted barley, And remember that dinner last night was half a turnip and a vague memory of bread. The livestock aren't doing great either. Chickens stopped laying. Cows are thin. Pigs have become alarmingly valuable and suspiciously scarce. A neighbour disappeared last week, and there's a very awkward silence when someone mentions stew. Food shortages weren't just local. They were continental. Markets collapsed. Grain became currency. And if you had a carrot and no children, you were basically a feudal overlord. In Constantinople, prices soared so high, even nobles started to experience the novelty of being hungry. In remote villages, things were worse. Starvation didn't come all at once. It came slowly, cruelly, and with zero interest in fairness. And then there was the psychological effect. With no sunlight to mark the days properly, time itself became vague. Was it morning, evening, Wednesday? Nobody really knew. They just kept working, praying, and hoping the sky would eventually apologize. Spoiler, it didn't. The clergy preached repentance. The nobles hoarded food. And the common folk? They stared at the grey sky and wondered if this was just what life was now. A long, cold, dimly lit episode of suffering, punctuated by the occasional rat. Hope became a luxury. Most people were just trying not to be the next funeral. In fact, if you had managed to stay alive through crop failure, plague, freezing weather, and general existential dread, congratulations. You were now qualified to be described as a survivor, which in 536 meant malnourished, traumatized, and still squinting at the horizon for a sun that wasn't coming back. After years of famine, plague, and eternal twilight, society began to do what societies do best under pressure: fall apart in slow motion while insisting everything is fine. It wasn't just about hunger anymore. The social fabric, already more burlap than silk, began to fray. Hierarchies broke down, labor systems collapsed, and people started behaving less like a community and more like contestants in a very bleak survival game. Local governments, if they hadn't fled or died of plague, struggled to maintain order. Coinage lost value. Trade routes dried up. And justice. Let's just say if you stole a loaf of bread, you either got a sermon or a sword, depending on how recently the local magistrate had eaten. The aristocracy didn't come out of this looking great. Many hoarded food. Some tried to raise taxes. Yes, during a famine, which was either brave or suicidal, depending on the peasant to pitchfork ratio. Others simply fled their estates and left the serfs to figure things out on their own. Spoiler, they did not. Religious institutions, meanwhile, became both sanctuary and scapegoat. Some priests told the starving masses to repent harder. Others tried to help, handing out what meagre stores they had. And then there were those who decided this was the perfect time to proclaim the apocalypse and start a new sect in the woods. Moral boundaries blurred. Theft became common. Violence rose. If someone in your village had food, they were suddenly both very popular and very nervous. And remember, there was no central news, no plague tracker app, no reliable updates from distant cities. Just rumors of divine punishment, of demons, of sunlight returning in distant lands, or of entire regions wiped off the map. People fled cities, villages disappeared, entire regions depopulated, and with no one left to maintain roads, fields, or temples, even the landscape began to unravel. Civilization didn't collapse with fire and glory. It just quietly thinned out, like someone erasing a painting with a wet cloth. The historians of the time weren't writing about politics anymore. They were writing about how the sky still hadn't turned blue. In short, the world didn't end. It just lost track of itself. Eventually, after years of death, darkness, and what must have felt like a very elaborate divine prank, the world began to recover, not with a bang, not with sunshine breaking through the clouds in a cinematic crescendo. No. More like a tired sigh and a few patches of sunlight that didn't feel like a cruel joke. By the early 540s, the mysterious ash veil began to dissipate. The sun, as if returning from a poorly explained vacation, started shining again, tentatively, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. Crops slowly began to grow again. Not well, mind you, but they grew. Farmers started planting with hope instead of pure desperation, and when something green poked out of the dirt, they didn't immediately cry from despair, just mild disbelief. In Constantinople, grain prices finally stabilized. Bread, once a sacred artifact, became edible again. The empire limped forward, patching holes in its economy and pretending everything had been part of the plan. In rural villages, new generations were born, ones that didn't remember the sunless years, and those who had survived. They aged with the expressions of people who had seen too much weather and not enough soup. Culturally, the trauma left a mark. Some scholars believe the doomy tone of later medieval apocalyptic literature had roots in these years, because once you've lived through famine, plague, social collapse, and fog that won't go away, it's hard to write cheerful poetry about springtime again. The population across Europe and Asia remained significantly reduced. Entire settlements had vanished, and rebuilding wasn't just about houses. It was about relearning how to live like humans again instead of cold, hungry ghosts. And even as normalcy returned, people lived with a kind of existential caution, like the planet might turn off the sun again just to see what happens. The Byzantine Empire staggered back to its feet. China's dynasties reshuffled and adapted. Scandinavia re-emerged, and eventually those Norsemen would sail out and become everyone else's problem. But in the background of all that, a collective, quiet relief that the worst might, just might, be over. For most of history, year 536 remained a confusing entry in the "something really bad happened" file. Ancient writers knew it was awful. Medieval chroniclers muttered about darkness and famine, but nobody had any idea why the sun had ghosted humanity, unless you counted "God is mad" or "demons ate the sky" as explanations. It wasn't until the 20th century, when humanity developed the ability to drill into ice instead of just falling through it, that the mystery started to crack. Enter the ice cores, long cylinders of ancient frozen layers pulled from Greenland and Antarctica, like the Earth's extremely passive-aggressive memory sticks. Within those layers, spikes in sulfur and ash, right around 536 AD, as well as two more in 540 and 547. Which led scientists to a conclusion the medieval world never saw coming. Volcanoes. Massive ones. Probably multiple. At first, researchers thought it was a big eruption in Iceland. Then they considered volcanoes in Central America. Then Indonesia. Or maybe Alaska. Basically, the planet coughed, and scientists are still arguing about which lung it came from. But the result was the same. Ash blasted into the stratosphere, where it spread across the globe, reflecting sunlight and lowering temperatures for years. Nature's version of dimming the lights and forgetting where the switch is. This insight changed how we understand climate disasters. It wasn't divine punishment. It was geophysics with terrible timing. What's fascinating is how modern science didn't just solve a mystery, it reframed history. Suddenly, the famines, plagues, and collapses of the 6th century weren't isolated events. They were connected. One massive natural event, or possibly 3 in a row, triggered a cascade of suffering that spanned continents. Even more sobering, it could happen again. Volcanoes don't care about your Wi-Fi or your global supply chains. They'll do what they did in 536, block out the sun and watch us panic. But at least now we'd understand why our tomatoes are dying. Still, knowing the cause doesn't change what people went through. For them, the sky went dark, the food ran out, and nobody had answers. It just took science 1/500 years to say, oh yeah, that was definitely the volcano. There have been bad years in history, plenty of them. 1347 had the Black Death. 1914 kicked off a world war. 2020, well, let's not open that can of face masks. But 536 AD still holds a special ice-crusted place in the top 10 most unpleasant human experiences list. It wasn't just bad. It was comprehensively miserable. A multi-year disaster combo platter with extra doom on the side. What makes 536 so haunting isn't just the volcanic winter, the famine, the plague, or the population collapse. It's the fact that all these things happened together in a pre-modern world already balancing precariously on mud and superstition. Imagine surviving 1 year of near-permanent twilight, food shortages and existential sermons. Then imagine year 2 shows up with a fresh volcanic eruption and a helpful reminder that you still haven't seen the sun. Then imagine the Black Death's less famous, equally rude cousin knocks on your city gate in year 5 and says, "Hi, I live here now." People back then didn't know what was happening. They had no word for climate disruption, no concept of volcanoes erupting thousands of miles away, and definitely no epidemiology podcasts. All they saw was a world that suddenly stopped making sense. And perhaps that's what really sticks with us. Because even now, with satellites, scientists, and 24/7 news cycles, there's something profoundly unnerving about a year when the sky went out and nobody knew why. It reminds us that nature doesn't need a reason. The planet can, at any time, throw a tantrum powerful enough to send us scrambling back to firewood and guesswork. And yet, people endured. They suffered, starved, buried loved ones, and carried on. Not because they had answers, but because there wasn't really a choice. So yes, 536 was the worst year to be alive, and it lingered, like a cosmic hangover, for decades. But it's also a story of survival. Quiet, stubborn, frost-bitten survival. And maybe that's what makes it so compelling. Because deep down, we all suspect that if the sun went out tomorrow, we'd still argue over bread prices, blame the government, and try to make stew from whatever's left, just like they did. The 12th century didn't start with a bang, but with a whisper of stone blocks being hauled by oxen and chants echoing from dusty construction yards beside crumbling Romanesque churches. Something monumental was stirring. Across France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, and even the distant fringes of Spain, cathedrals began clawing their way up toward heaven. But why? Europe was changing, fast. Cities were growing, trade was rebounding, and the church wanted to show off a bit. It needed to remind everyone who was boss. And what better way to do that than by building the most awe-inspiring, terrifyingly massive buildings anyone had ever seen? These weren't simple upgrades. This was a full-on architectural arms race. Towns competed with each other not through war, but through stone. If one city built a church with a 50-foot nave, the next wanted one twice as long, with more stained glass, more towers, more miracles carved in limestone. Bishops wanted their legacy in stone. Kings wanted the people to see divine authority in architecture. And ordinary people? They were just trying to get into heaven. One coin, one pilgrimage, one back-breaking labour shift at a time. And yet, none of this would have worked if someone hadn't figured out how to cheat gravity. Enter the Gothic style. This new approach flipped everything people thought they knew about church design. No more thick, squat walls. No more tiny windows that let in just enough light to remind you that daylight existed. Gothic architecture embraced air and light. It wanted God to see in, and for you to see out. Pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and those miraculous flying buttresses. All of it was about going up, letting in more light, and making people feel utterly insignificant in the presence of the divine. What started with modest experiments at Saint-Denis and Sens would explode into a full-blown phenomenon. For the next 4 centuries, Europe would be locked in a frenzy of stone cutting, scaffold climbing, stained glass assembling madness. And the craziest part? Most of these cathedrals took centuries to build. Entire generations would be born and die before the final spire was added. This wasn't just construction, it was faith made physical, one flying buttress at a time. Behind every cathedral wasn't just divine inspiration, it was an army of dirt-covered geniuses. And at the front of that army? The master mason, not a priest, not a noble, but a glorified stone nerd with a compass, a chisel, and a death wish. These were the rock stars of the Middle Ages, except they didn't wear leather. They wore linen covered in limestone dust. Master builders weren't just contractors. They were architects, engineers, artists, and sometimes borderline cult leaders. Because when you're asking peasants to haul multi-ton stones 50 feet into the air using ropes and wooden pulleys, you better have charisma, or at least a very convincing floor plan. But here's the twist. Most of these men weren't nobles. They rose through the guild system, beginning as lowly apprentices, sweeping floors and fetching tools. Then they became journeymen, travelling from site to site, cathedral to cathedral, picking up secrets like Pokemon cards. Only after decades of experience, and possibly losing a few toes, would one be trusted with the title of master. And the math, terrifying. Without calculators or modern geometry textbooks, these builders figured out how to distribute weight from ceilings the height of a redwood tree, across vaults, down columns, and out through flying buttresses. If they got it wrong, entire sections could collapse, and often did. There were collapses in Beauvais, in Lincoln, even parts of Cologne. Each disaster became a lesson for the next project. But for every failure, there was a marvel. The precision in places like Reims or Amiens Cathedral is enough to make modern engineers sweat. These men calculated angles by eye, with strings and chalk, creating load-bearing marvels that still stand centuries later. They worked with stonecutters, woodworkers, glaziers, and labourers in what was essentially the most chaotic group project of the century. They didn't just draw blueprints, they commanded entire construction ecosystems. And sometimes they died before their vision was completed, leaving their successor to guess what on earth they were thinking when they sketched that weird triple arch over the nave. Gothic cathedrals weren't just big, they were alive, with stories, symbols, saints, monsters, and morals chiselled into every surface. If you couldn't read Latin, no problem. The stone would preach to you. Let's start with the portals. These weren't doors, they were divine gatekeepers. Imagine walking into church beneath rows of saints, apostles, and the Last Judgment, all staring down at you, carved into arch after arch. Jesus at the centre, serene but judging. Sinners being dragged to hell by demons, right next to merchants and bakers. A subtle message. Pay your tithe, or else. And gargoyles. They weren't just medieval waterspouts. They were theological bouncers, meant to terrify evil spirits and perhaps a few ill-behaved parishioners. Grotesques snarled from rooftops, stretching their stone faces in eternal agony or laughter. Some were demons. Some were hybrids, dogs with human faces, bishops with wings. Every cathedral had a bestiary carved into its skin. Inside, the columns weren't plain cylinders. They were forests of symbolism. Capitals at the tops of pillars held tiny sculpted dramas, Cain killing Abel, drunken Noah flashing his sons, or monks fighting snails, don't ask. The choir stalls were even cheekier. Hidden in the woodwork were carvings of flatulent peasants, lusty monks, and animals doing very unholy things. But it wasn't all jokes and damnation. The stonework was also a Bible in 3D. From the creation to the passion of Christ, from Old Testament kings to obscure local saints, every inch taught a lesson. These cathedrals were theology textbooks for the illiterate, monumental sermons frozen in limestone. And the artisans? They worked in secret. Most didn't sign their names. Their reward wasn't fame, it was faith, though occasionally one would sneak in a signature. A tiny self-portrait, perhaps, or a carved insult aimed at a rival mason 2 levels below. The stone told stories, but also served as propaganda. Kings, bishops, and local patrons often demanded their own faces appear beside saints. Political rivals were turned into demons. Enemies of the church found themselves eternally boiling in bas-relief hells. Step inside a Gothic cathedral and the first thing you'd notice, after your neck started to ache from looking up, was the light. Not just sunlight, but coloured light. Divine light. Light that told stories and made you feel like you'd walked into another world entirely. Welcome to the age of stained glass. In the Gothic mind, light wasn't just illumination, it was theology. God was light. And the cathedral was supposed to be a taste of heaven on earth, so of course it needed windows that glowed with celestial fire. The windows were massive, especially compared to their Romanesque predecessors. And they weren't just decoration. They were epic murals in glass. The rose windows of Chartres and Notre Dame. They're basically round, radiant comic books. You'd see the creation of the world in one panel, Noah's Ark in another, and a full genealogy of Christ squeezed into a kaleidoscope of red and blue. Every pane had meaning. Red stood for blood and martyrdom, blue for the Virgin Mary, gold for divine light, green for rebirth. Each piece was hand-cut, painted with fine lines of iron oxide, then fired in a kiln. The result? Glass that could outlast kingdoms. These weren't solo projects either. Stained glass artists worked in teams. Designers, colorists, painters, glass cutters, all orchestrated like a medieval film studio. And the funding? Often crowdsourced. Local guilds would sponsor entire windows, sometimes sneaking in a self-serving panel at the bottom. This window donated by the fishmongers. May their herring always be fresh. The effect on worshippers? Pure awe. Imagine you're a peasant from a village where your biggest excitement is the yearly pig slaughter. Then you walk into Chartres, and boom, walls of light, saints beaming down in ruby and sapphire, halos blazing brighter than the sun. It was like stepping into the New Jerusalem. But there was more than just beauty. The windows preached. You'd learn the life of Christ in sequenced panels, see the virtues battling the vices, spot allegories of sin and redemption, all without needing to read a word. And as the sun moved, so did the mood. Morning brought golden warmth. Midday filled the nave with holy fire. At dusk, the windows flickered like dying embers, reminding everyone that light, like life, was fleeting. To the average medieval villager, flying buttresses probably looked like architectural witchcraft. Big stone arms launching out from the cathedral's walls, connected to piers that didn't even touch the building. Madness. But to the master builders, these strange limbs were the secret weapon of the Gothic Revolution. Here's the problem they had to solve. Gothic cathedrals were tall, insanely tall. Their ceilings reached 100 feet or more. And those towering ribbed vaults? They pushed tons of weight outward, not just down. If you didn't support that sideways thrust, your fancy church would become a very expensive pile of rubble. Enter the flying buttress, a structural cheat code. Instead of building thick, heavy walls like the Romanesque churches, Gothic architects wanted walls full of windows. And since windows are basically architectural holes, they needed something else to hold the building up. That something else was the flying buttress, an external arch that caught the outward force of the ceiling and channeled it safely into a distant pier. The result? Interior walls could be thin, open, and filled with glorious stained glass. But these weren't just functional bones. They became part of the cathedral's aesthetic. Builders sculpted them, decorated them with pinnacles and crockets, even turned them into miniature stone forests. Look at Notre Dame of Paris or Amiens Cathedral, and you'll see these buttresses marching like Gothic soldiers around the apse. Each one was a mathematical triumph. They had to be placed precisely, angled correctly, and balanced with the exact amount of counterweight. Too weak and they'd snap under pressure. Too strong and they'd crush the nave. It was a medieval Goldilocks problem, except the porridge was tons of granite, and failure meant disaster. Of course, not every experiment went well. Beauvais Cathedral famously overreached. It aimed to be the tallest of them all, but despite flying buttresses and reinforcements, parts of it collapsed. Several times. It remains unfinished to this day, proof that even the best builders could fly too close to the architectural sun. But when they got it right, the effect was gravity-defying. You'd walk into a space that felt like it was floating. Walls disappeared. The ceiling hovered like a cloud. And you had to ask yourself, how is this even standing? At some point, Gothic builders looked up at their already impressive cathedrals and said, what if it were taller? And thus began one of the strangest arms races in medieval Europe, the vertical competition to see who could poke God in the eye first. Towers weren't just about ringing bells or getting a good view of the town square. They were statements of wealth, of faith, and of raw civic ego. Cities weren't content with modest steeples. They wanted the tallest, the most dazzling, the one pilgrims would talk about long after their feet stopped bleeding. Each cathedral had its own approach. Notre Dame in Paris grew two massive twin towers that loomed like stone guardians over the Seine. Chartres stacked its towers unevenly, one Romanesque, one later Gothic, because symmetry is for cowards. And Cologne Cathedral? It set out to become the tallest structure in the world. Construction began in the 1200s. They didn't finish until the 1880s. That's commitment. Spires came next. The pointed hats of the Gothic world. Not just towers, but elongated spears that reached absurd heights, defying logic and daring gravity to try something. Salisbury Cathedral's spire, for instance, stands over 400 feet tall. They built it without steel or modern cranes, just ropes, muscle, and a bit of medieval recklessness. But going higher came with danger. Every inch upward increased the load, the sway, the risk. High winds could snap unsupported spires. Lightning strikes were constant. Some towns even hired spire watchers, people who basically stared at the structure to see if it looked like it was about to fall. And yet, people kept building. Part of it was theological. The higher the structure, the closer to God. But part of it was also psychological. These were skyline wars. If your neighbour city had a taller spire, you were basically admitting their faith and purse was bigger. Unacceptable. The result? A jagged forest of stone erupting across Europe. These towers weren't just for looking pretty. They held bells the size of wagons, clock mechanisms, even relics. Some doubled as watchtowers or defensive platforms. Others just existed to impress, intimidate, or occasionally terrify. Gothic towers didn't whisper heaven. They screamed it. But for all the power and ambition in stone, the real heartbeat of a cathedral lay somewhere else, in the human drama of those who built, worshipped, and sometimes died within them. Beneath every towering cathedral was a foundation of bone, figuratively and sometimes literally. These monuments to faith weren't built by angels or saints. They were built by muddy-booted, callous-handed humans, stonecutters, carpenters, glaziers, blacksmiths, and a small army of anonymous labourers who got none of the glory and all of the back pain. Let's start with the masons. They weren't just stone stackers. They were craftsmen who turned quarried rock into load-bearing poetry. A master mason might have designed the cathedral, but it was the ordinary journeymen and apprentices who did the carving, chiseling, and hauling. Every block had to fit perfectly. No margin for error. A mistake could mean collapse. Then there were the carpenters. They didn't just build scaffolding, they built machines. Giant treadwheel cranes powered by men walking like hamsters. Movable platforms. Precision wood forms for pouring mortar. The wooden framework inside a vault or arch had to be exact, or the whole thing would cave in the second they removed it. No pressure. And let's not forget the mortar mixers, the rope makers, the water haulers, and the guys who had to climb to the very top of a spire to install that one final stone. All for a few coins a week, and the privilege of not dying on the job. Many labourers lived on site, in makeshift villages that grew up around cathedral grounds. These camps had their own rules, their own food stalls, and likely more than a few taverns. Accidents were frequent. Tools slipped. Stones cracked. Sometimes entire scaffolds gave way. Injuries were often fatal, and workers simply replaced. But why did they do it? For some, it was steady work in a world with few options. For others, it was a way to serve God, to be part of something eternal. And for the few literate or ambitious ones, it was a path to guild membership, even social mobility. Most never saw their work completed. A cathedral could take 100 years or more. One mason might carve a corner of a doorframe, knowing that his grandson would finish the opposite side. That was the rhythm of cathedral building. Long, grueling, generational. You didn't build for yourself. You built for eternity. And though we don't know their names, their fingerprints are still there. In the stones, in the glass, in the weightless arches that somehow still stand. You've seen the outside. You've marvelled at the spires and light-drenched glass. But what was it for? Step inside a Gothic cathedral in its prime, and it wasn't just a building. It was a cosmic stage, and the Mass was the main performance. The day began at dawn, when monks or canons would chant the first of 7 daily prayers. If you were a peasant, you didn't come for those. You came on Sundays, feast days, or when the bells rang loud enough to remind you that salvation might be at stake. The Mass wasn't a quiet affair. It was sensory overload. Incense clouded the air. Bells rang at key moments. Latin chants echoed off the stone, reverberating through the vaulted ceilings. You might not understand a word of it, but that wasn't the point. You were witnessing the divine, not attending a lecture. And then there were the relics. Nearly every cathedral had one. A saint's finger, a splinter of the true cross, a vial of holy tears, some real, most creatively acquired. These weren't just curiosities. They were spiritual powerhouses. Pilgrims travelled hundreds of miles to see them, touch them, or be near them. And where pilgrims went, money followed. Relics meant prestige, donations, and a booming souvenir market. Special events turned the cathedral into full-blown theatre. Think of coronations, royal weddings, funerals, or Easter masses with choirs stacked in balconies, organs roaring, and bishops in gold-threaded vestments processing down the nave. It was holy pageantry, designed to awe and overwhelm. But it wasn't all grand occasions. Cathedrals were everyday spaces too. They served as meeting halls, schools, law courts, even shelters during storms. Merchants sometimes set up stalls outside. Townspeople gathered on steps. Children probably played tag in the cloisters when no one was looking. There was tension, of course. Not everyone was welcome equally. Women were often relegated to the back. The poor might get free bread, but were rarely heard. And the clergy? They lived in their own world, strictly hierarchical, well-fed, and occasionally more corrupt than holy. Still, the cathedral was the heart of the city, a place where heaven met earth, where time moved differently, and where stone and ritual wove together to remind everyone of their place in the grand, divine order. By the late 1500s, the Gothic cathedral, once the crown jewel of Christendom, was becoming a relic of its own. The world was changing, and those majestic towers and stained glass sermons were suddenly out of step with the times. The Renaissance had arrived, and with it came a new obsession: classical antiquity. Architects and patrons now looked to ancient Rome for inspiration. They wanted symmetry, domes and clean lines, not flying buttresses and forests of pointed arches. To the Renaissance mind, Gothic architecture wasn't divine, it was barbaric. They even called it Gothic as an insult, after the Goths who had sacked Rome centuries earlier. But it wasn't just aesthetics. The Protestant Reformation shook the very foundation cathedrals stood on. Reformers like Martin Luther railed against the Church's extravagance and its obsession with relics, rituals, and indulgences. All things cathedrals had come to embody. In many Protestant regions, cathedrals were stripped of their treasures. Stained glass was smashed, statues decapitated, altars whitewashed. The light that once danced across sacred scenes now fell on bare walls. Meanwhile, Catholic regions doubled down. The Counter-Reformation led to Baroque renovations. Gold, marble, and theatrical flair replaced subtle Gothic mystery. The once shadowy nave became a stage of glittering drama. Some cathedrals were altered so completely that their Gothic bones vanished under layers of stucco and cherubs. And let's not forget the financial collapse. Wars, plagues, and shifting trade routes meant less money for grand projects. Many cathedrals were left unfinished. Towers stopped mid-rise. Spires became stumps. Skilled guilds dissolved. The age of master masons faded like smoke through a broken rose window. But the death of the Gothic wasn't the end of its story. In the 19th century, a Gothic revival swept across Europe. Romanticism rekindled a fascination with the medieval. Writers like Victor Hugo turned decaying cathedrals into literary stars. Restoration campaigns, some careful, others catastrophic, tried to bring back their former glory. Think Notre Dame before the fire. Think Cologne Cathedral, finally finished after centuries. Today, Gothic cathedrals still stand, some pristine, others battle-scarred. They are monuments not just to faith, but to human ambition, imagination, and the desire to touch the heavens with stone. The Gothic boom may have ended, but its echo still rings through every arch, every shadow, every beam of coloured light. By the late 13th century, the age of Crusader kingdoms in the Holy Land was crumbling into dust. The great Christian conquests, Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, had all fallen one by one. All that remained of nearly 200 years of European crusading effort was the port city of Acre, a final flickering outpost on the Mediterranean coast, a symbol of glory turned into a fortress of desperation. Acre wasn't just another city. It was the Crusader capital, the beating heart of what was left of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a place of stone walls, Gothic churches, and clashing cultures. It was packed with merchants from Genoa and Venice, warrior monks from the Templars and Hospitallers, and nobles clinging to titles long stripped of real power. But beneath the wealth and towering battlements, Acre was a powder keg. The European factions within the city spent as much time fighting each other as preparing for the inevitable siege. The writing had been on the wall for years. The Mamluks, a military elite from Egypt, had steadily wiped out every Crusader stronghold in their path. Under Sultan Qalawun, and later his son Al-Ashraf Khalil, the Mamluks crushed city after city, and they didn't negotiate. They erased. In 1290, a foolish spark ignited the storm. Newly arrived Crusaders, hot-headed and ignorant, massacred Muslim merchants in Acre during a drunken rampage. It was exactly the excuse the Mamluks needed. Khalil declared war. By April of 1291, his massive army, possibly over 100,000 strong, had encircled the city. Siege towers were rolled forward. Tunnels were dug under the walls. Catapults hurled stone and fire day and night. Inside the city, panic swelled. The defenders, while courageous, were hopelessly outnumbered. Appeals for reinforcements to Europe went unanswered. Acre was isolated, cut off by land and soon by sea. Still, the defenders clung to hope. The double walls of Acre had resisted sieges before. The Templars and Hospitallers prepared for the worst. Noble families packed their treasures. Priests offered prayers. Soldiers sharpened blades that would likely never leave their sheaths. Because this wouldn't be a siege for ransom or territory. This would be the end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. On April 5th, 1291, the Siege of Acre officially began. The Mamluk army, led by Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil, had arrived in force. Engineers, archers, elite cavalry, and enough siege equipment to flatten a city twice the size. They surrounded Acre on all sides, building massive wooden siege towers and digging trenches, while war drums thundered across the plains outside the city's great walls. The sound wasn't just for intimidation. It was a promise. No mercy. Inside Acre, the defenders stared out at a sea of tents and banners. The Mamluks were experienced and disciplined. This wasn't some ragtag force. These were the same warriors who had defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut, destroyed Antioch, and taken Tripoli. Their track record was clear. When they came, cities burned. The Crusaders responded as best they could. The Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights took up their positions on the battlements. Civilians were pressed into carrying water, repairing damage, and building makeshift barricades. Priests walked the walls, offering last rites to men who hadn't even drawn swords yet. But the unity inside the city was a fragile illusion. The Italians, Venetians, Genoese, and Pisans bickered over ships and control of the harbour. French and English factions distrusted each other. The King of Jerusalem, Henry II of Cyprus, was technically in command, but he was more figurehead than leader. No single strategy united them. Meanwhile, the Mamluks wasted no time. Their sappers began tunnelling under Acre's outer walls, placing wooden supports and filling the shafts with flammable materials. When lit, these tunnels would collapse the walls from below. Siege engines hurled massive stones day and night, pounding towers, smashing rooftops, and sending splinters of masonry through homes, churches, and courtyards. Each day, more of the city crumbled. Each night, the defenders rebuilt, exhausted and outmatched. Khalil remained methodical. He knew Acre's walls were strong, but not unbreakable. He simply needed time. The defenders, already stretched thin, were trapped in a cycle of panic and false hope. And the psychological warfare was just as brutal. Muslim heralds shouted promises of death if the city didn't surrender. Survivors from previous Mamluk conquests knew those weren't empty threats. Acre was isolated, surrounded, and running out of time. As April turned into May, Acre's walls still stood, but barely. The constant pounding of Mamluk siege engines had reduced towers to rubble, breached outer defences, and left the streets littered with debris. The city's defenders clung to their remaining strongpoints, exhausted and outnumbered, but not yet broken. The Templars and Hospitallers led the charge, literally and figuratively. These weren't green recruits. They were veterans of brutal wars, trained for moments like this. Clad in chainmail, bearing blackened shields and blood-stained tunics, they launched counterattacks from the inner walls and towers, hoping to stall the Mamluk advance. Every sally outside the gate was a gamble. Sometimes they returned with heads, other times not at all. Inside the city, panic was spreading. Civilians, women, children, merchants, priests crowded the docks, praying for ships that never came. Some tried to flee, bribing sailors for space aboard merchant vessels. Others turned to the church, clinging to relics and saints, hoping for divine intervention. King Henry II of Cyprus had fled earlier, leaving behind a fractured command. Coordination among the defenders unravelled. The Genoese blamed the Pisans, who blamed the Templars, who blamed everyone else. It was a city besieged not only by the Mamluks, but by its own dysfunction. Still, there were moments of desperate heroism. One night, the Mamluks breached a small section of the wall near the accursed tower. Expecting a quick slaughter, they poured through, only to be met by a sudden countercharge led by the Hospitallers. In the chaos, swords clashed in torchlight, bodies tumbled into the surf, and for a brief moment, the Crusaders pushed them back. The breach was sealed, temporarily, but these victories were fleeting. Food supplies began to dwindle. Wells were poisoned or destroyed by falling debris. Disease crept through the refugee-packed quarters. Rats fed on the dead in the streets, and morale rotted with them. The defenders were running out of everything: men, weapons, time. Sultan Khalil, meanwhile, remained calm. His engineers dug deeper, his catapults fired higher, and his archers filled the skies with arrows. He was in no rush. He knew Acre's time was measured in days, not weeks, and the final blow was almost ready. The defenders of Acre still prayed for a miracle. On May 18th, 1291, the waiting ended. At dawn, the Mamluks launched their final assault. Siege towers rolled forward. Scaling ladders were raised. Tunnels dug beneath Acre's eastern wall were packed with kindling and set ablaze. The ground trembled as fire devoured the wooden supports, and with a thunderous crack, a massive section of the wall gave way. Stone, dust, and defenders collapsing into the moat below. The horn of battle sounded, and the Mamluks surged through the breach. They poured in by the thousands. Mamluk heavy infantry, Sudanese archers, horsemen leading charges even within the crumbling city streets. The Crusaders met them with everything they had. Templar knights formed a shield wall, halberds ready. Hospitallers rallied the terrified civilians, herding them toward the docks. Priests shouted prayers over the din of clashing steel. But it wasn't enough. The defenders were too few, too tired, and too disorganized. The city that had once withstood wave after wave now cracked like old armor. Buildings burned, homes collapsed. The fighting moved from street to street, house to house, tower to tower. Every corner became a battlefield. The Genoese quarter fell first, overrun in hours. The Venetian compound held out longer, fortified like a mini fortress, but was eventually set aflame. Screams echoed from the alleys as the Mamluks advanced with ruthless precision. Those who resisted were slaughtered. Those who fled were hunted down. One of the last strongholds was the Templar fortress near the harbour. Thick walls, reinforced towers. It had been the final fallback point in case of disaster. Now, it was the last place left. Inside, women and children huddled in cellars, while knights made a final stand on the battlements. From the roof, they could see the city dying. Acre, once the pride of the Crusader kingdoms, now a furnace of smoke and blood. As night fell, the Crusader resistance collapsed. Most surviving knights fell back to the docks, hoping to escape by sea. The harbour became a desperate bottleneck. Families crammed onto overcrowded ships, shouting, crying, some leaping into the water in panic. Only a few vessels made it out before the Mamluks seized control of the port. By the end of the day, Acre was no longer a city. It was a graveyard. As the rest of Acre burned and bled, one bastion still held, the Templar fortress, a massive stone complex near the sea. Its walls had resisted Mamluk sieges before. Now it became the last shelter for hundreds of survivors, knights, women, children, and priests, all crammed into the great halls, praying the walls would hold just one day longer. The fortress was commanded by Peter de Sèvres, the Templar Marshal of Acre. He knew what was coming. He ordered the gates barred, the battlements manned, and the underground passages sealed. The knights stood shoulder to shoulder, some wounded, others barely able to lift their swords. They were not fighting to win. They were fighting to die with purpose. Outside, the Mamluks surrounded the fortress. Sultan Khalil sent envoys to negotiate a surrender. The terms were harsh: imprisonment for the knights, slavery for civilians. The Templars refused. They had no illusions about mercy. The Mamluks brought up siege engines and began their final push. Day after day, they battered the walls. But the fortress was built to withstand far worse. For over a week, the Templars held them off, firing from towers, hurling stones, pouring boiling oil on attackers who dared the ladders. Inside, conditions were dire. Food had nearly run out. The wounded groaned in the dark. Children cried. But still, they fought. One knight reportedly dragged himself to the wall with a broken leg, just to hurl a stone before collapsing. Then, on May 28th, disaster struck. The Mamluks breached the outer wall of the fortress. Fighting raged inside the courtyard. Templars, civilians, everyone capable, picked up a weapon. It was hand-to-hand combat, brutal and unrelenting. The defenders were pushed back into the inner chambers of the fortress, step by bloody step. Realizing the end had come, the Templars made a desperate decision. They collapsed part of the fortress on purpose. In a final act of defiance, they lured Mamluk troops into the lower chambers and detonated the underground armory. The explosion ripped through the walls, killing attackers and defenders alike in a storm of fire and stone. The fortress fell, but it didn't surrender. The last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land had gone down not with submission, but with fury. Acre was lost. The dream of Christendom in the east shattered. When the smoke cleared, Acre was no longer a city. What had once been the vibrant capital of the Crusader states, bustling with markets, churches, and foreign embassies, was now a field of ash and corpses. The Mamluks had taken it all, street by street, wall by wall, and they left nothing behind but ruin. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil didn't just want victory. He wanted erasure. He ordered the complete demolition of the city's fortifications. Every tower, every wall, every stone that had once protected the Crusaders was pulled down or shattered. The harbour was filled with rubble. The churches, some centuries old, were stripped, burned, or turned to mosques. What couldn't be reused was destroyed. The destruction was systematic. This wasn't vengeance. It was strategy. Khalil wanted to make sure Acre would never again be a foothold for Europe. Never again a landing point for crusading armies. Never again a symbol of Christian presence in the East. Those few who survived, mostly non-combatants who'd been captured, were enslaved or executed. Some noblewomen were taken into the harems of Mamluk elites. Some children were sold in markets from Cairo to Damascus. Their names vanished. Their stories ended in silence. The sea was choked with the wreckage of broken ships and bloated bodies. And the stench? It lingered for weeks, months even. News of the fall reached Europe like a slap. Panic swept through the courts of France and England. Popes wept. Preachers called for another crusade, but the willpower was gone. The last spark of crusading fervour had died with the walls of Acre. The kings of Europe had their own wars, their own dynasties to worry about. The Holy Land was lost, and they knew it. The Templars, once the elite warriors of Christendom, were shattered by the loss. They returned to Europe, bruised and aimless. Their power would never recover. In less than 2 decades, they would be dissolved entirely, accused of heresy, tortured, and executed. The fall of Acre was the beginning of their end. And for the Mamluks, Acre's conquest was a jewel in their crown. The dream of a Crusader kingdom in the Levant had finally been crushed beneath their boots. But the deeper legacy of the siege was just beginning, because while the city died, the myth of Acre, of Crusader glory and tragic collapse, was only just being born. The fall of Acre in 1291 wasn't just a military defeat. It was a historical exclamation point. For nearly 2 centuries, European powers had poured blood, treasure, and faith into the Holy Land. With Acre's collapse, the entire Crusader experiment came crashing down like its shattered walls. There were no more cities to retreat to. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, once strongholds, were quickly abandoned or surrendered. The Crusader states, once mapped in bold colours across Levantine coasts, vanished almost overnight. What remained was a faint memory, scattered relics, and the few who had escaped by sea, watching the smoke rise from the horizon. For the Christian world, it was a soul-crushing loss. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 had been bad, but Acre, this was the last domino. It symbolized not just military failure, but spiritual failure. Popes issued desperate calls for renewed crusades, but they fell flat. Europe was exhausted. Internal wars, plagues, and economic shifts pulled attention away from the East. The age of kings donning crosses and leading armies into the desert was over. Meanwhile, the Islamic world celebrated. The Mamluks, under Khalil, had done what generations of Muslim leaders had dreamed of. They had wiped the Latin presence from the region. Cities were reclaimed, mosques re-established, and trade routes reopened. Islam once again controlled the heartlands of the Levant, from Cairo to Damascus. And yet, not everything was so clear-cut. The Crusades had left behind deep scars. Cultural exchange, for better or worse, had transformed both East and West. Arabic texts had flowed into Europe. Architecture, medicine, even food had changed. But the wars had also embedded a legacy of mistrust, violence, and religious division that would echo for centuries. Acre's fall didn't just close a chapter, it ended a worldview. The idea that Europe could plant itself in the Middle East, enforce its will through divine mission, and hold territory in the name of faith. Gone. Instead, the memory of the Crusades would be romanticized, dramatized, and weaponized for generations. Knights in shining armor, noble quests, glorious failures. The truth was far messier, bloody, chaotic, and ultimately tragic. The fall of Acre marked the end of an era. But the Crusader myth, that was just beginning its long afterlife in legend. The fall of Acre sent shockwaves across Europe, not just diplomatically or religiously, but psychologically. For generations, Christendom had believed it was meant to control the Holy Land, that God was on their side, that Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Acre belonged to the faithful. Now, with the last Crusader stronghold gone, that illusion collapsed. The initial response was disbelief. Chroniclers wrote with outrage and grief. Priests blamed sin and corruption. Kings pointed fingers at each other. How could this have happened? How could an army of holy warriors lose to a sultan from Cairo? But beneath the surface, a quiet resignation set in. There would be no major crusade to reclaim Acre. No fifth, sixth, or seventh wave of European armies sailing to the east. Instead, Europe turned inward. The papacy shifted its focus to rooting out heresy at home. The Inquisition grew stronger. Monarchs redirected their ambitions to internal wars and dynastic struggles. The crusading spirit became more rhetoric than reality. In time, the image of Acre took on a different form in the European imagination. It was no longer a city. It became a symbol of lost glory, tragic bravery, and divine punishment. Songs and poems were written of noble knights fighting to the death. Painters and playwrights turned the fall into legend. But those who survived knew the truth. The refugees who had fled Acre, nobles, monks, merchants, children, returned to Europe broken. Many found no homes waiting for them. Some were taken in by monastic orders. Others wandered, telling stories of fire and blood. The Teutonic Knights eventually shifted their operations to Eastern Europe. The Templars returned to France, where the shadow of Acre would follow them to the pyre. In political circles, the fall of Acre marked the beginning of a new phase. Power was now rooted in land and law, not divine crusade. The era of religious conquest had reached its peak and was beginning its decline. And yet, Acre lingered. It lingered in memory, in propaganda, in the way Europeans spoke of the East, a place of danger, mystery, and opportunity, a land lost, and perhaps someday to be won again. The city itself had vanished, but the myth of Acre had just begun to spread, far beyond its blackened walls. Centuries after its destruction, Acre still haunts the imagination. Its stones were ground to dust, its churches razed, its walls pulled into the sea. But in the minds of European chroniclers and later historians, Acre became more than a city. It became the symbol of the Crusades' tragic fall. The place where chivalry died, where faith collided with futility, and where the dream of a Christian East was buried beneath Mamluk boots. And yet, what survived wasn't the truth of Acre, it was the myth. Romanticized in ballads and epic poems, Acre's defenders were remembered not as fractious warlords and disillusioned mercenaries, but as noble knights fighting valiantly to the end. The political chaos, the greed, the internal betrayals, all smoothed over in favor of a more palatable narrative. Martyrdom, heroism, destiny lost. The irony? Those who had actually lived in Acre probably didn't see themselves as part of a grand epic. They were merchants, sailors, cooks, scribes, prostitutes, pilgrims. People living in a complex, multicultural city where Arabic, French, Italian, Greek and Latin mingled in the streets. A city of contradiction, of monasteries beside brothels, crusading orders alongside Venetian bankers. It was never simple, but history rarely is. In the Islamic world, Acre's fall was remembered as a great victory, proof of Allah's justice, of the triumph over foreign invaders. But even that narrative often fades beneath the towering legacies of other Islamic conquests. For the Mamluks, Acre was one jewel among many. It mattered, but it wasn't the whole crown. Today, modern Acre, Akko, is a living city once again. A UNESCO World Heritage Site, with layers of Crusader architecture buried beneath Ottoman streets. Tourists stroll through ancient tunnels where knights once bled. Minarets stand beside old Gothic arches. Fishermen cast their nets from the same docks where refugees once leapt for salvation. The past isn't gone. It's just buried, under stones, under myths, under time. And that is the true legacy of Acre. It wasn't just a city or a battle. It was a crossroads, a collision point of cultures, empires, and ideals, a place where faith, ambition, and fear crashed together in one final, fiery moment. The Siege of Acre ended an era, but it also ensured that neither the Crusades nor the ghosts they left behind would ever truly be forgotten. Livia Drusilla was born in 58 BCE, at a time when the Roman Republic was convulsing. The daughter of Marcus Livius Drusus Claudianus, she came from a long line of patricians with a taste for power and a talent for surviving Rome's endless political bloodsport. Her birthright was privilege, but her world was chaos. Rome in the late Republic wasn't just politically unstable, it was an open wound. Civil wars raged between power-hungry generals, alliances shattered like pottery, and assassination was practically a career move. For a girl like Livia, raised in this furnace, the lesson was clear. Beauty might earn attention, but intellect, loyalty, and cold calculation earned survival. At just 15, Livia was married off to her cousin, Tiberius Claudius Nero, a staunch supporter of the Republic and an enemy of Julius Caesar. This wasn't a love match, it was a political maneuver, as most Roman marriages were. But young Livia quickly adapted to the role of Roman matron, loyal wife, mother-to-be, and quiet observer of the volatile tides around her. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, the real fireworks began. Civil war returned with a vengeance. Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's heir, fought to fill the vacuum. And Livia, she and her husband ended up on the losing side. Pregnant with her second child, she was forced to flee Rome, moving from one temporary refuge to another, while her husband dodged Octavian's wrath. That journey through exile, hardship, and near constant uncertainty hardened her. And when she returned to Rome under a fragile amnesty, she didn't just return as a survivor, she returned as someone to watch. That's when she met Octavian. He was 24, she was 19. Both were married. But when Octavian saw Livia, he saw something more than beauty. He saw an equal. Within months, both divorced their spouses. And in one of the most eyebrow-raising political marriages in Roman history, Octavian married Livia while she was visibly pregnant with her former husband's child. For the rest of her life, she would remain at Octavian's side. And when he became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, Livia became more than just his wife. She became his advisor, his partner, and, some whispered, his puppeteer. When Livia married Octavian in 38 BCE, the Roman elite choked on their wine. He was a rising political star, soon to become Augustus, Rome's first emperor, and she was a pregnant, recently divorced woman. Scandalous didn't begin to cover it, but Augustus didn't care. And Livia, she knew exactly what she was doing. Unlike his previous wife, Scribonia, whom Augustus dismissed on the day their daughter was born, Livia was no emotional distraction. She was quiet, calculating, and politically shrewd. Augustus didn't just marry a woman, he gained a strategist. From the moment she entered his home, Livia positioned herself not as a decorative partner, but as a co-ruler in all but title. She hosted salons, courted senators, advised her husband on political rivals, and carefully cultivated her image as the ideal Roman matron, dignified, obedient, loyal. But beneath the modest stola and veiled head was a mind sharper than half the Senate combined. Though she never received the title of empress during her lifetime, there was no such formal role. Livia wielded influence from behind the curtain. She was given her own household, her own finances, and even her own bodyguard. That was unheard of for a Roman woman. But Augustus trusted her implicitly, and Livia played the long game. She didn't push for public power. She made herself indispensable instead. When Augustus was away, Livia managed his affairs. When senators plotted, she whispered counterplots. When rivals rose, they often fell, sometimes with suspicious speed. Livia's fingerprints were rarely visible, but her presence loomed behind the scenes like a quiet spectre. And perhaps most important of all, Livia never gave Augustus a son. Their marriage was childless. But rather than fade into irrelevance, she ensured her own son from her first marriage, Tiberius, stayed close to the imperial orbit. Livia wasn't interested in being queen. She wanted to found a dynasty. To outsiders, she appeared passive, graceful, pious. She attended religious ceremonies, praised Augustus in public, and lived modestly in a city obsessed with excess. But those who underestimated her did so at their peril. Because while Augustus consolidated the Roman world with legions and decrees, Livia shaped the empire in silence, with whispers, favors, and quiet erasures. The question is, just how far would she go to protect the dynasty she was building? Rumors, as we'll see, suggest she didn't stop at political advice. For all her public grace and devotion, Livia Drusilla's name has always carried a scent of suspicion, specifically the sharp, sweet scent of poison. As Rome transitioned from republic to empire, rivals to Augustus fell like dominoes. And though history doesn't record Livia's hand on the cup, it certainly doesn't rule it out. The most infamous accusation: that Livia systematically eliminated anyone who stood between her son, Tiberius, and the imperial throne. Let's look at the body count. Marcellus, Augustus's nephew and early favourite. Dead at 19, supposedly of illness. Gaius and Lucius Caesar, Augustus's grandsons and adopted heirs. Both dead young, far from home. Agrippa Posthumus, the brutish final grandson, disinherited and mysteriously murdered after Augustus's death. All inconvenient, all removed. And Livia was always near. To her defenders, these deaths were tragic coincidences. Rome was full of disease, and power games were brutal. To her critics, Livia was the Roman Lady Macbeth, working quietly, removing pawns, and setting the board so only her son remained standing. Ancient gossip, especially from writers like Tacitus and Cassius Dio, leaned into this narrative. They painted Livia as cool, cunning, and ruthlessly maternal. They suggested she was the real architect of the imperial succession, not Augustus. In some versions, she even doctored Augustus's will or concealed his death long enough to secure a smooth transfer of power. But it's important to separate smoke from fire. There's no hard evidence Livia poisoned anyone. No confession, no trial. Her alleged victims died far from Rome in ambiguous circumstances. The Roman elite loved a good conspiracy, especially when powerful women were involved. Still, the pattern is convenient. Too many rivals dead. Too many inheritances redirected. Too many murmurs in the dark. Even Augustus, who loved and trusted Livia deeply, once joked that she was more concerned with the empire than with his health. It may have been said in jest, but like most Roman jokes, it carried a dagger underneath. Whether Livia truly slipped poison into cups or simply outmaneuvered her enemies with charm and strategy, the result was the same. One by one, the path to power cleared. And as the years passed, it became undeniable. Livia wasn't just building a dynasty. She was eliminating the competition. Tiberius was no golden boy. He lacked the charm of Marcellus, the popularity of Gaius and Lucius, or the legacy of Julius Caesar. He was awkward, cold, and deeply introverted, a man better suited for brooding alone on a cliff in Rhodes than standing at the head of the Roman Empire. And yet, thanks to Livia, Tiberius became emperor. Livia's mission to elevate her son wasn't easy. Augustus didn't trust him. Tiberius had a military mind, but little love for politics. He was known for his moodiness, his disappearances, and his very public retirement from Roman life in 6 BCE, a sulky middle finger to both Augustus and Livia. But Livia was relentless. She orchestrated his return. Slowly, methodically, she eliminated rivals and wore down Augustus's resistance. With each imperial disappointment, Marcellus's early death, Lucius's sudden illness, Gaius's failed eastern expedition, Tiberius looked more and more like the least worst option. Eventually, Augustus adopted him formally as son and successor. It wasn't love, it was resignation. And when Augustus died in 14 CE, the empire passed to Tiberius. It should have been Livia's moment of triumph, her son on the throne, her legacy secure. But power did strange things to Tiberius. Once in power, he grew even colder. Paranoid, suspicious. He left the city for long stretches, ruled through letters, and delegated power to the monstrous Sejanus. He resented the Senate, the people, and increasingly, his own mother. Livia, for her part, tried to maintain influence. She expected to be treated as Augustus had once treated her, as an advisor, a partner. She received the title Augusta, an unprecedented honor for a Roman woman. Coins were minted with her image, statues were erected in her honor. She sat on a throne beside her son during public ceremonies. But behind closed doors, Tiberius simmered. He accused her of manipulating him, of orchestrating a life he didn't want. He reportedly refused to consult her, and, most scandalously, he didn't attend her funeral when she died in 29 CE, leaving her corpse unburied for days, in a final public insult to the woman who had given him everything. Livia may have won the war for succession, but she lost the battle for her son's affection. Livia Drusilla understood something most Roman men didn't. Real power didn't always come from the Senate or the battlefield. It came from perception. And so, while Augustus crafted the empire, Livia crafted herself into the ideal Roman woman. Not a queen, not a ruler, but something far more dangerous, a symbol. She dressed plainly, in traditional stola and veil, never flaunting jewels or gold. Her hair was styled in the severe, modest fashion of Rome's matronly past. Publicly, she praised simplicity, virtue, and piety. Behind the scenes, she was directing networks of influence, managing estates, arranging marriages, and shaping political futures. But her greatest project was her own image. Livia became the poster woman for Roman values. Statues of her popped up across the empire, not just in Rome, but in provinces where loyalty to the new imperial order needed reinforcing. These weren't statues of goddesses or warriors. They showed her seated, serene, motherly. The message was clear. Rome's new empire was safe in the hands of a wise, moral, and traditional woman. It was a masterclass in soft power. She sponsored public works and religious rituals. She aligned herself with the goddess Ceres and the cult of Vesta, symbols of fertility and domestic order. While Augustus claimed to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, Livia made sure that marble included her. Even the coins changed. Some bore her face, something unheard of for a woman. Others referenced her virtues, pietas, concordia, fortuna. Livia wasn't just a matron. She was a moral compass carved in silver. This wasn't vanity. It was insurance. In a male-dominated world where women could be discarded at a whim, Livia embedded herself into Rome's political DNA. She wasn't an accessory to power. She was part of the machine. And Augustus played along. He mentioned her in his will. He left her a third of his fortune. He even adopted her into the Julian family posthumously, giving her the name Julia Augusta. A political move, yes, but also a recognition of her role in building the empire. Through image, through patience, and through ruthless charm, Livia turned herself into something new. A Roman woman too powerful to ignore, too revered to remove, and too intelligent to underestimate. When you look at the mess that was the Julio-Claudian dynasty, madmen, monsters, and megalomaniacs, you'd never guess it was built by a soft-spoken woman in a stola. But Livia Drusilla wasn't just Rome's first lady, she was its dynastic engineer. Her long game began with her own son, Tiberius. She cleared the board for him, but her ambitions didn't stop there. Her grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and stepchildren all were woven into a spider's web of alliances, betrothals, and strategic placements. This wasn't family planning. This was imperial architecture. She arranged the marriage between her granddaughter Livia and Drusus the Younger, her own grandson. Another granddaughter, Julia the Younger, was tied to Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a senator. Every move was a brick laid in the imperial foundation. But Livia wasn't just playing matchmaker. She was reinforcing bloodlines, consolidating loyalty, and keeping potential enemies under her watchful gaze. Even Germanicus, the wildly popular general and adopted son of Tiberius, had Livia's fingerprints on his ascent. He married Agrippina the Elder, Augustus's granddaughter, The union united Julian and Claudian lines, a symbolic and strategic triumph. Of course, dynasties built on politics and paranoia rarely stay clean. Infighting erupted. Accusations of treason, adultery, and ambition flared among the imperial heirs, and many historians believe Livia had a hand in steering or manipulating the chaos. If someone had to be exiled, discredited, or quietly vanished to preserve the dynasty's core, so be it. And the irony? The Julio-Claudian line would spiral into madness. After Tiberius came Caligula, Germanicus's son and one of history's most infamous tyrants. Then came Claudius, her great-nephew, and awkwardly her grandson-in-law. Then Nero, who was descended from both Livia's bloodline and her political plans. By the time Nero fiddled while Rome burned, Livia's family tree looked more like a bonfire. But make no mistake, every branch of that tree had been shaped by Livia. She didn't live to see the dynasty crumble, but she built its bones. While Augustus ruled an empire of marble and legions, Livia ruled a quieter empire, one of blood, marriage, and manipulation. Every emperor for the next half-century could trace his legitimacy back to her. In the history of dynasties, she wasn't just a link in the chain, she forged the chain. Livia Drusilla lived long. Too long, if you asked her son Tiberius. She had survived Julius Caesar's assassination, the fall of the Republic, a dozen rival heirs, and the transition into empire. She outlived Augustus, outmaneuvered her enemies, and turned her family into gods. But in her final years, she found herself in an increasingly bitter standoff with the very man she had sacrificed everything to empower, Tiberius. Their relationship was never warm, but as emperor, Tiberius grew colder still. He resented her influence, her lingering presence in court, her continued efforts to advise, and, perhaps, control him. And Livia, having spent decades guiding an empire, was not about to quietly retire to her villa. The court became tense. Tiberius began retreating from Rome altogether, withdrawing to Capri in self-imposed exile. He left governance in the hands of Sejanus, his ambitious and ruthless Praetorian prefect. Livia remained in Rome, surrounded by statues, honors, and the eerie quiet of being revered but no longer needed. When she fell ill in 29 CE, her death was not met with the mourning one might expect for the matriarch of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Tiberius refused to return to Rome. He didn't attend her funeral. He delayed her deification, denied her public honors, and, most cruelly, left her body unburied for days. For the woman who had shaped an empire, it was a cold and calculated dismissal. Was it petty vengeance, guilt, or perhaps a final act of defiance from a son who never asked to be emperor? Historians would later paint Tiberius as a brooding, paranoid ruler, haunted by his mother's legacy. Livia had orchestrated his rise, cleared his path, and ensured his power. But in doing so, she may have crushed whatever warmth existed between them. To Tiberius, her guidance likely felt more like a leash. She died at age 86, having lived through nearly 9 decades of Rome's most transformative years. No other Roman woman had ever wielded such sustained influence or held court at the side of emperors for so long. And yet, her final chapter was marked not by triumph, but by silence, betrayed not by enemies, but by the very son she had raised to rule. Livia Drusilla died a mortal, but Rome wasn't finished with her yet. Though Tiberius refused to honor her properly in death, the empire she helped shape still remembered. Her grandchildren, especially the Emperor Claudius, Her own great-nephew and grandson-in-law would eventually restore her place in the imperial pantheon. In 42 CE, over a decade after her death, Claudius formally deified Livia. She became Diva Augusta, a state goddess. It was a final cosmic promotion for the woman who had spent her life manipulating power from the shadows. Altars were built, priestesses appointed. Her image joined that of Augustus in temples and ceremonies. In death, she became what no woman before her had ever been, a god sanctioned by the Roman state. But sanctification didn't come with forgiveness. For centuries, Livia's name remained entangled in rumor. Ancient historians, mostly male, were never quite sure what to make of her. Tacitus portrayed her as calculating, cold, a woman who excelled in the arts of her sex. Cassius Dio cast her as an empress in all but name, domineering, manipulative, and possibly responsible for more than a few conveniently timed deaths. Then came Suetonius, with his blend of gossip and history. He didn't say outright that Livia poisoned Augustus, but he certainly let the rumor breathe. And yet, even her critics admitted her brilliance. She lived modestly. She ruled quietly. She never flaunted her influence, never gave a public speech, never took a formal political role. And yet she shaped the fate of Rome more than most men who wore the toga. Modern historians have tried to untangle fact from fantasy. Was she a murderer or just a master strategist? A loyal wife or a political operator? The truth may be all of the above. But her impact is undeniable. Without Livia, there is no Tiberius. Without Tiberius, there is no Julio-Claudian dynasty. Her hand guided the empire's first steps, her lineage ruled its first century, and her myth haunted its historians for 2 millennia. In a city of emperors, conquerors, and demigods, Livia did what no woman had ever done. She ruled Rome from the shadows and ascended to the heavens, not by sword or speech, but by survival. In the end, Livia Drusilla's story isn't just about palaces, poisons, or statues. It's about how one woman navigated the sharpest political landscape in history without ever raising a sword, or even her voice. Rome was a world that excluded women from real power. And yet, somehow, Livia rewrote the rules without ever admitting she held the pen. She never gave a speech in the Senate, never commanded an army, never held an official title during her husband's reign. And yet, for 5 decades, no major decision was made in the empire without her fingers brushing it first. She made herself indispensable to Augustus, not through seduction or softness, but through loyalty, intelligence, and absolute control over her image. In a culture that worshipped modesty in women, she became the living embodiment of Roman virtue. She was the wife, the mother, the goddess. But she was also the chess master, the kingmaker, and, some whispered, the Queen of Rome in all but name. Her genius was subtlety. Where other women of the imperial family, like Messalina or Agrippina the Younger, would be vilified for ambition, Livia escaped condemnation, cloaked in virtue. She wore tradition like armor. And in doing so, she created the blueprint for every powerful Roman woman who came after her. But her legacy is complex. The dynasty she built would unravel into madness and murder. Her descendants included emperors like Caligula and Nero, men whose excesses would stain the very name she had worked so hard to elevate. And her own relationship with Tiberius ended not in triumph, but in silence and coldness. Power came at a cost. Yet, despite all that, Livia endures. She remains one of the most fascinating figures in ancient history, not because she ruled Rome like a man, but because she ruled it like no man ever could, with patience, with silence, with the terrifying brilliance of someone who understood that real power doesn't shout, it whispers. Livia Drusilla didn't just witness the birth of an empire. She midwifed it. She didn't just preserve a dynasty. She engineered it. And she didn't need a throne or crown to make history. All she needed was time. And Livia had mastered the long game from the very beginning.